Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People story. When my wife and I purchased our first home together last year, it felt like a dream come true. After years of saving and scrimping, we finally had a little place to call our own. It wasn't anything too fancy, just a modest three-bedroom house on a quiet cul-de-sac. But to us, it was absolutely perfect. The neighborhood itself seemed idyllic too. Friendly folks who waved hello, kids playing ball in the street, block parties in the summer. It had that wholesome community vibe that you always hope for. Our next-door neighbors, the Petersons, were among the first to welcome us. An elderly couple who had lived there over 40 years. They were as sweet as could be, always offering gardening tips or a plate of fresh-baked cookies. The only less than ideal thing about the property was the backyard. Whoever had owned the place before us had let it go wild. Overgrown bushes, weeds as tall as me, rickety old sheds. It was a real mess. But my wife Allie and I were determined to fix it up and make that space our own. We spent the first few weekends attacking the jungle, yanking out overgrowth, pruning away dead branches. As the debris cleared, a property line became visible, with a row of tall sycamores right along the edge. They provided nice shade, so we were glad to have them. One day I was digging up the last of the weedy patches when I noticed something odd. The metal property line marker was about 2 feet closer to the sycamores than it should have been based on the measurements we had. Puzzled, I double-checked the marker against the original property plot. Sure enough, it was definitely too far over on our side. That's when it dawned on me. The previous owners must have moved it. They illegally expanded their property by encroaching onto ours. No wonder the trees were so close to the supposed line. Fuming, I went to speak with the Petersons right away. When I explained what I had found, Mr. Peterson's expression turned solemn. "I'm afraid you're right, son. Many years ago, our neighbors did move that marker over. Planted those sycamores too, all on your land." My hands balled into fists. "Well, that's just not right. This is our property they stole. We're going to set this straight." Mrs. Peterson nodded sympathetically. "We don't blame you one bit. In fact, we'd offered to help move them back where they belong. But our neighbors were quite difficult people. Took us to court once over the most trivial thing, so we thought it best to let the matter lie rather than stir up more trouble." I thanked the Petersons for their honesty and support. Allie agreed. We couldn't let this injustice stand. The next weekend we marched outside with tools in hand, determined to fix this mess. We dug around the base of the first skinny sycamore, but as its roots became visible, my heart sank. This tree was huge. Ripping it out would destroy a sizable chunk of our new yard. Allie saw my hesitation. "I know it's a shame, but we can't let them profit off stolen land. The space will recover." With a sigh, I nodded and kept digging. Suddenly, a shrill voice rang out. "Just what do you two think you're doing?" We turned to see a scowling, white-haired woman storming over from next door, waving her cane angrily. Without waiting for a response, she jabbed her cane at the sycamore. "How dare you threaten my trees? My husband planted those when we built this house." I tried to explain about the property line, keeping my voice calm and polite, but she wouldn't hear it. "Lies! All lies! We've lived here 50 years and that boundary hasn't moved an inch." She stomped back to her house, shouting threats to call the police over her shoulder. Discouraged but undeterred, I decided to try a legal approach first. I politely informed my neighbor that we would be having a licensed surveyor come assess the property line. If it showed her trees were on our land, we would have no choice but to remove them. For a moment she just glared, lips pursed. Then with a snort, she turned and limped away without another word. A few days later, the surveyor arrived. After thoroughly reviewing the markers and documentation, he confirmed exactly what I had expected. The line was several feet over onto our property. His report would hold up in any court. I delivered a copy to my neighbor. At first, she tossed it right back, but I persisted, gently explaining that we wanted to handle this amicably. With ill grace, she finally kept the report. I hoped now we could reach an understanding. But I soon realized she had other plans. Early Saturday morning, I was sipping coffee in the kitchen when the angry buzz of a chainsaw shattered the calm. I bolted outside to a shocking sight. My ornery neighbor was revving a chainsaw, slicing straight into the base of one sycamore. "What on earth are you doing?" I cried, rushing over. She waved dismissively. "Your trees are on my property now, so I'm removing them." I stared at her, dumbfounded. "You can't just kill them. We were trying to handle this legally and peacefully. She snorted. Peaceful? You started attacking my trees first. Brandishing the chainsaw, she threatened to call the police on me for destruction of property. As the deadly saw edged forward again, I felt utterly helpless. I couldn't physically wrestle this deranged woman to stop her. Flying saplings could hit my house, and clearly rational discussion was useless. Defeated, I turned and walked back inside, mind racing. I had to outsmart her somehow. Then it came to me. I'd fight fire with fire. If she wanted to play dirty, fine. I drove to the garden store and bought the biggest, fullest trees I could, along with bags of fast-growing seeds. Then I installed a new sprinkler system that reached every inch of our yard. Tonight, while she slept, I would get to work. Under the moon's glow, I hurried back and forth, digging holes and planting rows of saplings along the true property line. In went the tree seeds, too, buried deeply in the freshly watered soil. My neighbor would get quite the surprise in the morning. As expected, I awoke the next day to screams of rage. My front door flew open, and there she stood in her nightgown, eyes bulging. "Just who gave you permission to plant trees on my property?" I smiled politely. "Oh, but you informed me this was your property now, so I'm simply following your guidance. I wanted to make sure your new land had plenty of lovely trees." She sputtered in shock. For once, she seemed at a loss for words. She started to threaten me again, but stopped short, gaze fixed on something behind me. I turned to find Mr. Peterson shuffling over, a newspaper under his arm. "Morning, Rose," he called to my neighbor. "I see you two are having a dispute. Well, I won't just stand by again while you intimidate and harass these nice folks." He proceeded to calmly explain that he had already confirmed with 3 separate surveyors that she was in the wrong. As president of the neighborhood association, he made it clear that he would not tolerate any further harassment from her. She stood there silently fuming, knowing she was cornered. Then with a frustrated "humph," she turned and stormed off. As we watched her go, I finally felt the sweet taste of justice, and it seemed my tree-lined barricade would stand after all. In the months since, she has mercifully left us in peace, though she makes sure to scowl if we cross paths. The young trees are flourishing under my wife's diligent care, and while it was certainly an ugly situation, this experience brought our neighborhood together. The Petersons beam like proud parents when they admire our yard now. So, in an odd way, I'm grateful to that troublesome neighbor. She gave us the chance to fix what was wrongfully taken years ago. And our little home feels even more like ours, surrounded by life that we cultivated from her misdeeds. It just goes to show, patience, allies, and a few good trees can overcome even the most entitled of neighbors. The next one is a pro-revenge story. I was an account manager for a digital marketing company. We sold lead generation services to business owners to generate leads. One of our key selling features was if you turned on call tracking numbers and recorded phone calls, we'd guarantee you a certain amount of leads based upon your spend, and if we failed to meet that, you'd be entitled to a partial, or if we really failed, potentially a full refund. Some things to know about advertising. CTN, call tracking number. It's a unique number assigned to a certain point of advertising that consumers call. This number is only on that piece of advertising. It routes to the business line, and unless the consumer is very observant, they have no idea they are using a CTN. Call recording. If you turn on CTNs, we can record the calls and store the audio on our servers. The business has to consent to this. Also, when you call, you'll hear a message. This call is recorded for quality assurance type message. Both of those are required to be eligible for our service guarantee. Storytime Part 1, The Lay of the Land. The business in question was a small dad and son contracting company with a couple of employees. They primarily focused on smaller jobs, such as windows, drainage, finishing, etc. Unfortunately, this business owner was a royal PETA. He went back years, and his account was filled with nothing but complaints. Also, there was a strong suspicion that he was racist, because his last account manager was black. The business owner, whom we will name Scott, refused to ever meet in person with the previous manager. Also, I was white. He had no issues finding the time to sit down with me and tell me how bad our service is. Well, it's coming up to contract renewal and he says we aren't producing his leads, and he wants to put in a claim for failing to meet our service guarantee. I spoke to my manager about this, and he said he wants me to listen to his calls, write a detailed report, and present my findings to the manager. The manager is worried this may end up in court due to the dollar amounts involved. Nearly a whole working week of hours. I probably spent damn near 40 hours on this. And I wrote a detailed 24-page report outlining the results of our advertising. To say I shredded this business owner's business practices is an understatement. The report was a straight-up attack on his poor customer service skills, disorganization, inability to execute, and complete and total failure of anything resembling any sense of standard business practices that just make logical sense. I will share with you a few examples of the types of calls I listen to. Small calls where multiple phone calls are truly epic in their total incompetence. Customer 1, I was a small-time landlord who had received quotes from Scott for work on 3 different properties. The landlord had accepted Scott's quote and agreed to do business. In one voicemail message, offered to pay a deposit to start work. Throughout 4 voicemail messages, this poor landlord went from, "Hey, I want to pay you," to, "Are you okay?" to, "Why the heck aren't you returning my calls?" Yes, I said voicemails. Scott had gone out to this man's properties, quoted his pricing, and then straight up refused to do anything more. Why? I genuinely had no idea. I called the customer in question and said I was from the Quality Assurance Agency and was doing a survey on Scott's performance. The guy ended up paying Scott's competitor about 15% more to do the work and was utterly beside himself on why Scott ignored him. I was also confused. FYI, all my calls were recorded and put into the company records. Customer 2. This one in particular really annoyed me. Again, the public housing office called Scott to get a quote on work that involved 25 different homes. Scott was kind enough to answer the phone this time, which, ironically, was one of the few times he ever answered the phone. Initially, Scott sounded happy to get such a big, profitable job. Then Scott learned 2 things. 1. It was Section 8 housing. 2. It was a neighborhood that was predominantly Black Hispanic. Immediately upon learning this, Scott informed the housing office that unfortunately he super booked, not true, and that this area is actually out of his service area, not true. The housing office was confused and asked, "So you're not interested in bidding?" And Scott said, "No, I'm not," and hung up. He didn't even say goodbye. So I made a quality assurance call to the housing office, and the lady was completely confused about why Scott wasn't even remotely interested in the job. Luckily for Scott, the lady didn't realize that Scott was racist because discrimination against a protected class is a crime. Customer 3. It was an overseas phone number from Japan. A service member stayed up late to call Scott during his business hours. This person told Scott he was deployed overseas. Still, over the weekend, someone broke into his home back in the States, where Scott operated out of. He was trying to arrange for a new door, mentioning this was an emergency as his wife was being forced to stay in a hotel. Scott never returned his calls, nor made any effort to contact him via the email he provided, nor did he call the wife, who was local. It was a super easy job that Scott could have done in about an hour or so and made a solid profit. I think that's enough examples. Part 2. Review and Plan. The actual report at the end said, out of the X phone calls, Scott failed to properly service the leads in about 70% of the cases, and that I could keep on going on. Still, I felt that a clear trend had been established. It wasn't that our service wasn't producing leads for Scott. It was that Scott was a racist, bigoted individual who everyone strongly disliked. Obviously, I said that in more professional language. When I presented the report to my manager, he looked at it and said, "Damn 24 pages. I asked if it was okay, and he smiled and said, "I have a pretty good idea of what this is going to say." He said he'd review it and get back to me. So a day later, he came to me and said he had gone over the report, the VP had gone over the report, and he asked what I thought the recommended course of action should be. My recommendation? Remove all discounts, charge Scott the total price for our services, and clearly explain that our job is to provide him with leads, and it's his job to sell those leads. If he can't convert our leads into business, that's not our problem. Scott was getting a 70% discount. Our price was built with discounts in mind. My manager said he'll probably cancel, and I asked my manager, "And is that a problem?" If Scott was going to remain my client, he was going to pay dearly for that privilege. If he wasn't willing to pay, I was happy to let him walk. My manager smiled and said, "Nope." Part 3. The Meeting. My manager and I called Scott and arranged a meeting. I created a PowerPoint summarizing my findings. About a third of the way through, Scott gave in and told me to get to the point. I knew this was going to be a heated meeting, so I wanted my manager present both as support and a witness. So I explained that it's our job to bring him leads and it's his job to sell them. His failure to do that is not our problem. He got irritable and upset, and my manager backed me up. He said, "Fine, I'll renew my contract at the same rate." To which I said, "Yeah, you see, you didn't let me get to that part. We have new pricing for you." Scott asked, "Lower?" I said, "Oh no, not lower." My manager smirked, and Scott asked me for the new rate. I hit him with the full rate, which was 3 times what he was paying. Scott was furious with me, saying I was overcharging him, ripping him off, and that I was a horrible salesperson. He told my manager I should be fired for treating him like this. My manager looked at me, and I'd been waiting for the moment. Truth be told, I gave 0 cares about what Scott thought of me. If anything, my goal was to get him to cancel. "Scott, you're a challenging client. Therefore, the pricing of our service needs to reflect the challenge of providing you service. So we will be charging you our full rate. If you'd like, I'd be happy to go over why this ROI still makes sense based on our past performance." This was a wording I'd gone over with my management before using it. My manager felt it was fine. It felt so amazing to say those words. It was the nicest way I could say, "You're difficult. If I'm going to work with you, it has to be worth my while." Scott said we were a bunch of greedy pricks. He said, "I'm going to cancel." To which I said, "That is an outcome we have decided is acceptable, if that's what you choose to do." Scott huffed and said, "And what about my refund?" Dismayed, I said, "Scott, we've clearly demonstrated we did our part. The reason why you aren't bringing in sales is because of your company's inability to close on the leads we generate." Scott retorted, "So you're saying I don't know what I'm doing?" To which I responded, "Scott, if you agree to sign at the new rate, I'd be happy to sit down with you and help you, free of charge, on how to improve your sales techniques and close more of your leads." This is me telling him he doesn't know how to run his business, and it was very much meant as an insult. Scott exclaimed, "Nah, forget you. I'm calling my lawyer." I replied, "So I take it you're not going to renew?" He said, "No way." And my manager said, "That's fine. Would you like us to email you our report on your leads?" Scott responded, "Sure, I'll show my lawyer." For your information, we never heard from Scott's lawyer. We wished Scott a good day, and he left. Later, we wrote him an email, attached the report, and also told him that if his lawyer would like the recording in question, we could send that file over as well. Our bases were covered, and we knew it. I suspect he also came to the same realization, but he had too much pride to admit that. Part 4. Make sure that dagger is nice and deep. A few weeks went by, and my manager said we had to shut down his account, so I needed to call him and ask him what he wanted to do with his CTN numbers, which we controlled. In our contract, we stated that at the end of the agreement, the customer has the right to have the numbers ported over for a fee. It would have been normal to waive the fee as a gesture of goodwill, but Scott desired 0 goodwill, and he received what he desired. I told my manager there was no way I was porting the numbers for free, and just like his quote, I was charging him the full rate of $15 per number. The total came out to just a bit over $100. So I called Scott. I got his voicemail, but he didn't answer. I wrote him a registered letter, and in that letter I outlined that he had 30 days to respond. We had his CTNs, and if he was willing to pay a $15 per number port fee, we would transfer those numbers over to his phone provider. One morning I woke up to about a dozen hateful text messages in which Scott told me to go burn in hell. I took that to mean that Scott was not interested in porting over his numbers, and I reviewed those texts with my manager. We saved those messages and uploaded them to his account, so is that all? Of course not. Part 5. But, wait, there's more. So here I was with 7 CTN numbers that had been in service for literally years. Those 7 numbers were saved in Scott's customers' phones. And, to many of Scott's customers, those numbers were Scott's number. Obviously, they wouldn't be advertised to anyone, but that doesn't mean they won't produce phone calls. Now, if I just let the numbers die, the customers will call and simply be told, "This number is no longer in service." Now, I'm not entirely sure if what I did was legal, but it's been quite a few years, so I feel comfortable about introducing you to Bobby. Bobby was another Southern boy, but as much of an a-hole as Scott was, Bobby was a sweetheart. His mama would bake me pies for our meetings. He was a complete joy to work with. Bobby also owned a similar business to Scott's, but Bobby's business was more advanced, did more types of jobs, and also serviced the same area. So I submitted a service request to port all of Scott's 7 CTNs to Bobby's account, and I waived the fee. So all of a sudden, hundreds of Scott's customers would think they were calling Scott, but they'd get Bobby. Bobby had all his calls routed to his secretary Ashley, who was an angel. Ashley was also a wickedly talented saleswoman, and I know for a fact she'd be able to take Scott's clients and convert them for Bobby. So that's what I did. I had those 7 CTNs ported over to Bobby. This did a few things that benefited nearly everyone involved. Bobby got more business. I produced more leads for Bobby, which meant Bobby was comfortable spending more money with me, which meant I made more money. Scott's old customers got better service. Part 6. Capitalize on my revenge. At the next performance meeting with Bobby, Bobby was very pleased with the sudden uptick in new customers. He even asked me, "What did you do to my account?" I smiled and said, "I reviewed your account and made a few tweaks. Have you seen any improvement?" He absolutely did. He asked me, "Did this cost me anything extra?" I said, "Nope." He ended up increasing our spend with us by about 40% on additional services. I Googled Scott's business about a year later. He wasn't in business anymore. Wonder why? No, my company never caught on to me porting over the numbers. I strongly suspect our legal department would not have been pleased. The next one is a petty revenge story. A little bit of background. My mom and my neighbor have been having a property dispute for a couple of years now. Our neighbor's property overlaps the back corner of our property with an area about 4 feet by 10 feet, not even the full length of the back border of our property. The neighbors before either family moved in set up a fence that gave us the overlap of the property. It's been like that for nearly 20 years. Recently, there's been a lot of back and forth between them. It started with my mom setting up a raised bed for a garden on the property being disputed, PBD. He took apart the garden and put a bag of yard waste on it. Then my mom set up a property with rocks and sticks. He responded by dumping all of his trash that was in his backyard on the other side of his fence, on the PBD. I know I'm not easy to get along with, but I tried to help. No yelling, insults, or name-calling on my part. I talked with the neighbor twice by knocking on his door, and he threatened to sue me if I did so again. There's a lot more to the story. The dispute just escalated to the point where both parties are in the wrong. My mom isn't a saint. My whole family knows that. The good news is everything settled down when I convinced my mom to let him be, get a surveyor, and get documentation on where the property line is. We got people from the city to come down and look at the trash he put down on the opposite side of his fence, going past the PBD, and force him to clean it up. Everything was good. Mom did not interact with him. We left the fence alone. We're just waiting on the surveyor. He decided to put up a sign after 2 weeks of no interaction, saying my mom is a Karen. Now she is, but doing this just to troll him and have me deal with the fallout pissed me off. The best thing I could think of was putting up our own sign that faces us, not him. It has a flurry of insults about him, so my mom laughs at our sign and doesn't get mad about his. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We'll see you again tomorrow.